Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. Love is one of the most captivating emotions we humans can experience. Love also has a way of finding us when we least expect it. Sometimes it has this uncanny ability to bring together two people who at first glance may seem like they belong in entirely different galaxies of the universe. Sounds familiar? You know, the kind of couple who seem to defy all odds and make everyone around them do a double take. Don't tell them we said that. Love has the power to move mountains and inspire acts of kindness. It can illuminate our lives and fill our hearts with joy. From the gentle touch of a lover's hand to the melodic whispers of promises, love can transcend time and space, enveloping us in a blissful haze of passion and desire, making us truly feel alive. But enough about the good side of love. How many people actually talk about the bad side? Sure, love can make our hearts race, our minds swirl and our souls soar. Yet for some people, love in its intensity can also possess a darker side. It can become an all-consuming obsession, distorting perceptions and driving people to desperate measures. Sometimes in the name of love, lines are blurred, boundaries are crossed, and the very essence of morality is challenged. This raises the question, when will love ever push us over the edge and lead us to commit evil acts? Well, it's most likely to happen when it's taken away from us. Aidan Tyrone Poulter was born in August 1961. His parents were a British couple who had made the decision to migrate to New Zealand in search of a better life. But despite the excitement of starting a new life in a foreign land, Hayden's early years were marred by a tumultuous relationship with his father. From a young age, Hayden's father, known for his explosive temper and abusive behavior, would frequently erupt into episodes of violence. This created a strained and challenging dynamic between the father and son that persisted over time. The hostile environment at home was palpable, with the constant fear of his father's outbursts casting a dark cloud over Hayden's childhood. The unpredictable and volatile nature of his father's behavior left Hayden feeling constantly on edge, anxious and vulnerable. It's no surprise that as a young boy, Hayden struggled to understand why his father treated him with such cruelty, an experience that likely had a profound impact on his sense of self-worth and confidence. Eventually his father left New Zealand and returned to Britain, leaving Hayden to be raised by his mother. In his teenage years, Hayden would often find himself in foster care and government care facilities known as boys' homes. Unfortunately, it was during this period that he claimed to have experienced physical and sexual abuse. In 1978, at the age of 17, Hayden made the decision to join the Navy, perhaps prompted by a sense of enlightenment or a desire for a fresh start. However, his stint in uniform didn't go so well, and he was eventually discharged from the Navy. Following this, Hayden went on to try his hand at various jobs such as shearing, fishing, farming, advertising and even demolition work. This period of job exploration may have been driven by his search for a suitable career path, or it could have been a time where he was still figuring out his passions and struggling to find his calling in life. Nevertheless, 17-year-old Hayden was constantly changing jobs with remarkable frequency. It could also be due to his frequent run-ins with the law. You see, Hayden had a history of multiple misdemeanor charges dating back to his teenage years. When we looked at the records, it was revealed that he had accumulated a staggering 67 criminal convictions by the age of 35, all of which were nonviolent in nature. Hayden's life was also marked by significant challenges, including his struggles with epilepsy and depression, which were further intensified by his excessive use of alcohol and drugs. This destructive cycle of substance abuse and mental health issues eventually reached a critical point, resulting in 3 distinct instances where Hayden attempted to take his own life. He had also briefly entered a romantic relationship with a woman and became a father to a son. However, by the early 90s both his partner and son had left him, leaving him feeling abandoned and alone. The extent of the physical and mental anguish he endured is difficult to imagine, and yet his despondency persisted, relentlessly casting a long shadow over his entire life. However, one day in 1990 Hayden reached a breaking point and made a decision to seek help. It's 1990 in Auckland, New Zealand. The air was crisp and cool with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of fresh flowers blooming in the nearby gardens. With a mixture of trepidation and determination, Hayden made his way to the Odyssey House, a facility for individuals with drug and alcohol addiction. Each step he took towards the entrance was cautious yet resolute. "I can do this. Just a few more steps, just a few more steps, and everything will be fine. I can do this," he muttered under his breath. As he approached the house, Hayden drew in a deep breath, and with a determined heart he opened the doors into the facility. The atmosphere of the Odyssey House was calm and inviting, perhaps even offering a sense of refuge. Hayden sat quietly and listened intently as one speaker after another shared their stories of battling substance abuse and their life struggles. However, his attention was captivated by one particular member, a woman named Trudy Spires. Trudy was a single mother and part-time mass. She had sought refuge at the facility in her pursuit to overcome her challenges with alcohol. Hayden, on the other hand, was there to address his addiction to marijuana and LSD. Despite the differences in their vices, it was evident that both of them shared a common purpose: the pursuit of sobriety and a better life in each other's company. They found solace and support as they embarked on their paths towards recovery. Together they also found one other thing that we mentioned earlier: love. Love does work in mysterious ways, but in this case it might not be for the better. As Hayden's stay at the rehab house neared its end, records indicate that the couple got into a relationship and decided to leave the rehab house together, but their addictions remained a challenge they had yet to overcome. Nevertheless, the pair rented a flat in Andale, a quiet suburb in Auckland. During this period, Hayden worked in demolition, working tirelessly to make ends meet. Trudy, on the other hand, worked part-time as a sex worker on record. Trudy's sister described the couple as normal and nice, even though they had their fair share of arguments. Her sister also shared her positive experiences with Hayden, saying in the mid-90s the couple found themselves in a familiar struggle. Hayden remained heavily dependent on narcotics while Trudy continued to abuse alcohol. As their addiction issues persisted, their situation seemed bleak, but everything was about to take a turn for the worst. On August 29, 1996, Trudy Spires entered a local dairy shop and robbed it, holding its owner at knife point. According to the police report, Trudy entered the shop and caught the owner off guard by putting her left arm around his chest and pressing her right arm, which held the knife, against his collarbone. Tensions were high as she then demanded the owner complied, giving her about $198 from the cash register. What happened next was unexpected. Trudy threatened the owner to call the police, saying as the owner called the police, Trudy's voice could be heard on tape saying around this time she also made unusual comments, such as when the police arrived at the dairy and entered, Trudy adamantly refused to comply with their commands to put down the knife. Her tone grew aggressive as she issued a threat when an officer found the left side of Trudy's body exposed towards him. He fired 2 shots, one hitting her in the left shoulder and the other in the left arm. Trudy dropped the knife and eventually collapsed to the floor, where she was handcuffed and later taken from the scene by ambulance. Trudy Spires was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison for the armed robbery. She was transferred to Christchurch Women's Prison to serve her sentence. Unfortunately, Hayden couldn't sustain their rental payments for their flat after Trudy's incarceration, and he was now left homeless. It's unclear where he stayed during this period, but according to Hayden himself, the emotional toll of losing his girlfriend and his home triggered something within him, something that was building up for years for Hayden Patar. This incident had caused a new second identity to surface, one that he calls Hell. It was October 19, 1996. 2 months after Trudy, his beloved girlfriend, had committed the robbery. Hayden Polar was scouring a stretch of bars on a road with a disturbing intention, as he candidly stated himself. Around 5:00 a.m. Hayden came across a 21-year-old sex worker named Natasha Hogan. He approached her with the intent of soliciting her services, and after negotiating they agreed on a price of $60 for oral sex. However, Hayden expressed a preference for the act to take place in a park rather than his car. Natasha agreed, and after they got into his car he drove her to Simon Street Cemetery before proceeding to the park. After Hayden received the services he paid for, he retrieved a belt buckle from his belt and viciously struck her. It was dark, cold, and not a single soul in sight. There was no one out there to see what they were up to, and no one to hear Natasha's cries for help. After delivering 6 consecutive strikes, Hayden realized that the buckle had broken in half, but Natasha was miraculously still alive. Undeterred, he then attempted to strangle her, but even this effort proved futile. Natasha was still alive, but she was barely hanging on. Determined to complete his heinous act, he proceeded to brutally slam a 33 kg rock onto her head, killing her. Perhaps the most alarming fact was that when he was questioned about the excessive violence used during Natasha's murder, Hayden would be quoted on record saying the *** wouldn't die. Hayden then took her handbag with him as he fled the scene. He returned to his car and drove west while rummaging through Natasha's handbag in hopes of retrieving his $60. However, his efforts were in vain, as his money was still in Natasha's pocket. He then pulled over on an empty road to dispose of the handbag and his blood-stained belt buckle. He continued driving west for another half hour until he arrived at a public beach. Once there, he entered a public toilet to clean himself up. Sources state that after cleaning the evidence on himself, Hayden Poulter sat along the shoreline, observing the sunrise on the early spring morning while contemplating the gravity of what he had done. At approximately 9:55 a.m. on the same day, the police were alerted and arrived at the park. It remains unclear who notified them, but according to some sources, a local nun who was walking her dog in the park stumbled upon the horrific scene. The following details will be graphic. When the police found the lifeless body of 21-year-old Natasha Hogan, they discovered that she had been brutally battered and pinned under the massive 33 kilograms rock. Her corpse was found face down, with her dress pulled up to her chest and her underwear pulled down to her knees. Her body was covered in blood and semen was present. The large rock had caved her head inwards and a condom was found stuffed in her mouth. Upon launching the investigation into Natasha Hogan's murder, the police quickly realized that the list of potential suspects was extensive. Due to the nature of her occupation, there were numerous individuals who could have been involved in her death. They then made a public appeal urging anyone who had seen Natasha on the night of her murder or witnessed anything suspicious to come forward and contact them. 6 days later, on the morning of the 25th of October 1996, an anonymous letter arrived at the bustling newsroom of the New Zealand Herald. Upon opening the envelope, employees found a lengthy letter inside. The letter was characterized by messy handwriting, excessive vulgar language, and frequent misspellings. Due to the inappropriate language used in the letter, we won't be reciting its contents. However, we will provide a summary. The letter was a crude confession to Natasha's murder filled with vulgar references against women. The sender claimed that Natasha was the fourth of his murder victims, and he claimed to have been instructed by Satan to commit the crime. The letter concluded by describing the murder, stating, "I might target a law enforcement officer next. Signed, MBK." In no time at all, this information was sent to the police and the hunt was on for this person named MBK. On October 26, 1996, just 1 day after the letter was received at the New Zealand Herald newsroom. Hayden Poulter visited Cleopatra's massage parlor located on 4th Street. It was apparent that Cleopatra was not a conventional massage parlor but rather one that offered unique services. Hayden proceeded to book a 1-hour session with a Thai masseur named Lara Nafiti. As the first hour drew to a close, Hayden requested additional time with Lara and booked another hour. As Lara left the room to prepare some coffee, Hayden reached under the bed and pulled out a knife. When Lara returned, hell broke loose again. If you recall from the previous episode, Hayden had a girlfriend named Trudy Spires whom he met while in rehab. The two of them had left rehab before completing their treatment and had been living together ever since. Side note: rehab didn't work. They continued to abuse drugs and alcohol, which made it extremely difficult for them to stay sober. 2 months ago, Trudy was sent to prison for an armed robbery she had committed. This broke Hayden's heart. Their love for each other may not have been like fairy tales, but it was genuine. Losing his girlfriend followed by his home left Hayden feeling devastated and fueled his desire for revenge. Inside the caravan, Hayden meticulously washed his leather jacket, which was drenched in Natasha's blood. The next day, when Donna Spires returned from her night shift at 7 a.m., she immediately noticed that Hayden had taken care of his laundry and the leather jacket that was once blood-stained was hanging. She said, "The first thing I noticed was he'd done his washing. It was hanging on the line and his leather jacket was washed and hanging there too. I just thought, what a stupid male to wash a leather jacket, fancy putting it through the machine. I'd never have thought he'd just killed someone." And there was blood all over the jacket. For the next few days, Hayden remained out of sight, leaving no trace of his whereabouts. On October 25, 1996, the same day that the anonymous letter arrived at the New Zealand Herald's newsroom, Hayden Poulter took all of his stuff and left the caravan. Miss Spires, tell me about what you saw in the caravan. All his stuff was gone, everything, so he must have taken it that morning when he went to work. Donna wouldn't know it at the time, but Hayden was making his way to a massage parlor with a large 16 centimeters knife concealed in his pocket. He was looking for his next victim. On Saturday, the 26th of October, 1996, Hayden Poulter entered Cleopatra's massage parlor. "Hello sir, how can I help you? Do you have an appointment?" Herbert Norris, the manager, asked Hayden. After some small talk, Norris then presented Hayden with a choice between two Thai masseuses, one of whom was a woman named Laura Nimford. After considering his options, Hayden seemed to show interest in Laura and paid $50 for an hour-long session. The two of them then left for a spa room located nearby. At the end of the hour, Hayden asked for additional time and booked another hour. Upon hearing this, Lara exited the room to confirm the extension with her manager before proceeding to prepare some coffee. While doing so, she commented to her colleagues about the additional hour, expressing her sympathy for Hayden by saying, "It's no problem, I feel sorry for him." Little did Lara know that as she stepped back into the room and shut the door, she was about to come face to face with hell. Moments later, loud banging sounds echoed from within the walls of the spa room. The frenzied screams of Lara could be heard piercing through the air. The other Thai masseurs and Herbert Norris were alerted by the commotion and immediately rushed towards the door, their hearts pounding with fear and dread. This is a news excerpt from the New Zealand Herald describing the events of the attack. As Mr. Norris stands outside the spa room, the door suddenly opens and the customer stands naked with a large knife in his hands. He stabs Mr. Norris in the forehead before pulling the knife out and turning it on the other Thai masseuse, stabbing her in the arm, chest and back. Despite this frenzy, the customer notices Mr. Norris has rid. He straddled him and stabs him repeatedly in the chest and upper body area. Before returning to the spa room, he stabs Lara Nimford a further 2 times in the chest before dressing and fleeing out a second-floor window. An eyewitness later tells police that when Hayden walked across the car park, he walked with purpose and was determined but did not seem nervous on that day. All 3 victims suffered from multiple stab Wounds. Unfortunately, Herbert Norris and Laura Nimford did not survive their injuries. However, in Kanachasumrath, the other masses present at the scene survived the attack. In the evening of that fateful day, Hayden Poulter made his way to the Auckland Central Police Station. He had a limp and it was evident that he had sustained a leg injury. During his escape from Cleopatra, upon reaching the police station, he approached the front desk and asked to speak to a constable about important matters. Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me. Officer, Hayden said to an officer that had his back towards him. Yes, sorry about that. How can I help? Hayden's clothes and hair was in disarray. He had bruises and cuts as well as some swelling on his face and body. However, it was the blood stains on his clothes that drew the officer's attention. The officer eyed Hayden's disheveled appearance wearily, his hand instinctively inching towards his gun. Wait, listen to me. Hayden interrupted. Get me a constable. I need to speak with a constable. It's regarding important matters. Officers then led Hayden to a room for a videotaped confession. The room was dimly lit with a small table and a few chairs placed around it. Hayden took a seat as the officers set up the video equipment to record his statement. He appeared to be visibly distressed and agitated, with his clothes stained with blood and his face contorted with fear and guilt. The atmosphere was tense and the officers were on high alert, not knowing what to expect from him. Once the recording had begun, Hayden began to speak, his voice shaky and uneven. Hayden confessed and provided the officers with a detailed account of the day's events, including his confession to killing 21-year-old Natasha Hogan a few days prior. He vividly described the heinous acts he committed and the gruesome details of the stabbings that took place in the massage parlor. Hayden said that the employees at the massage parlor were part of a gang that was plotting against him. Perceiving the imminent danger, he made the decision to take their lives. As the officers listened to the details of the crime, they were filled with an overwhelming sense of shock and horror. Hayden also stated that he had no memory of the week that elapsed between Natasha Hogan's murder and the attack at the massage parlor. According to him, his alter ego, referred to as Hell, was responsible for driving him to commit the heinous crimes. This is what he said on record. Moreover, he also confessed that after killing Natasha, his personality, named Hell, became even more savage and bloodthirsty. You've already done it, you've been blooded, it's easy now. Despite his actions, Hayden did express remorse. He understood that his actions had caused irreparable harm to the families and loved ones of those he had murdered, and that nothing he could do would change what had happened. On September 1, 1997, Hayden Tyrone Poulter entered a guilty plea in the High Court to the rape and murder of Natasha Hogan, as well as the murders of Herbert Norris and Lawton Nimford. 3 days later, on the 4th of September 1997, Hayden returned to the High Court for sentencing. This is a statement he prepared, read aloud by his lawyer to the court. It's been a long time since I've heard from you. I'm still struggling to come to terms with it all. I am constantly plagued and tormented with bad dreams. For me, it is a punishment on its own and something I have to live with for the rest of my life. The remorse I have within me is genuine and deep, especially for Natasha, as her life was a lot like mine, filled with abuse and violence. I do not care if no one believes what I'm saying, but I need to say how sorry I am. I am sorry, Natasha. I am sorry, Lotta. I am sorry, Herbert. I am so very sorry. At the end of the hearing, Hayden Poulter was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 15 years. 14 years had passed since Hayden was sent to prison after being eligible for parole in 2011. Hayden confessed that he had created the persona of Hell because he couldn't face the reality of his own actions. He later acknowledged that his drug addiction was the main cause of his crimes. In 2014, the parole board noted some progress but still felt that Hayden had a long way to go before his release. However, after participating in several controlled releases and receiving positive feedback, the board proposed his release in June 2018 to a rural address with family members and work, provided Hayden would be subjected to 11 parole conditions for life and 15 special conditions for 5 years including GPS monitoring and a ban on contacting his victims, the media or prostitutes. A violation of any of these conditions would result in a breach of parole carrying a maximum penalty of a year's imprisonment. Hayden Poulter was eventually released from prison in June 2018, 22 years after becoming New Zealand's first serial killer. Records state that he changed his name to John Leon Lorenzo and moved in with his sister, where he started a landscaping business. Throughout his release there were no major issues that were reported, but towards the end of August 2018 there were reports that he had resumed taking drugs and was allegedly considering staging his own death to evade his parole conditions. After only 2 months of being released, Hayden Poulter was recalled to prison. The exact reason for his recall has not been disclosed publicly, but many suspect that it was a breach in his parole, possibly a drug relapse or an attempt to solicit a prostitute. Less than a month later, on the 24th of September 2018, an article was published by the New Zealand Herald. Hayden Poulter, 56, was found dead in his cell. The prison director could not confirm specifics about the dead inmate. He was found by staff at Unlock on Saturday morning. Staff provided immediate assistance, but the prisoner was unable to be revived. In 2003, the New Zealand government passed the Prostitution Reform Act, which entirely decriminalised prostitution in the country. This decision was met with significant debate and controversy. Some critics argued that the change would mean a massive wave of prostitutes roaming around the streets, with some even saying the community has had enough. It's not fun to come out in the morning and have to clean up condoms lying in your garden and on the fence. Despite these criticisms, the government emphasized that the Act's main goal is to protect the human rights of sex workers and prevent their exploitation. There was never any intention to promote or condone prostitution, but rather to establish a system that safeguards the well-being of sex workers. Story 2. On the 15th of July 2009, a 30-year-old man named Tao Bung Hok walked into the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Sanganggar headquarters in Shalam, Malaysia. Tao was a former journalist, but now he was serving as a political aide to a rising state assemblyman in Sanganggar's newly elected government. Under that new administration was a man named Ian Yong Han Wa, a fresh face in the opposition coalition, someone who was rather vocal about transparency and reform. However, just a day earlier, officers from the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, or MAC, had raided Ian Yong's office. They were investigating the alleged misuse of public funds, and now they wanted to speak with Tao, which is why he was here today. Tao Bung Hok had been called in as a witness to assist in an ongoing investigation, but that evening he didn't return home. The police and state investigators would later suggest that Tao's death may have involved foul play, but the MAC denied everything. They insisted that Tao's death was a case of suicide. This would become one of Malaysia's most explosive political deaths in modern history, a case that would drag courtrooms, government agencies and public trust straight into the spotlight. Tao's family remained firm. There were no signs he was struggling, no indication he was thinking of taking his own life. The court would later agree, stating that his death was likely the result of foul play, and yet the MAC continued to insist that it was suicide. So if Tao didn't jump, then what really happened on the 14th floor of the MAC building? Things are not adding up. Someone must be lying to understand how Tao Bung Hok ended up in that building. We need to go back long before the courtrooms, raids or press conferences. Tao was born on April 20, 1979 in Malacca. He was the third of 4 children. In a modest, tight-knit family, his father Tao Leong Hui drove a taxi for a living. His mother Tong Shuhor stayed home to care for the family. His parents were not wealthy people, but they did give their children what they could: structure, support, and the belief that if you worked hard and stayed honest, you could Make something of yourself from a young age. Tao was the kind of boy who paid attention to the world around him. He wasn't loud or rebellious, he listened more than he spoke. Teachers remembered him as thoughtful and well-mannered. Someone who took pride in doing things properly. He did well in school and eventually earned a place at university. CABS in Malaysia, one of the country's top public universities where he majored in communications. University opened up his world. It gave him the tools to articulate what he had long observed in silence: the cracks in the system, the unfairness that others ignored, and the power of information. That's what drew him to journalism. After graduation, he believed that if people knew the truth, they'd demand better. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing impact. Tao worked as a journalist for a local Chinese language newspaper. He covered local politics, community issues, and stories that often went unnoticed. His reporting was careful, well-sourced, and grounded in facts. He wasn't one for sensational headlines. He focused on accuracy, on context, on giving people the full picture. But over time something began to shift. As much as he valued journalism, Tao started to feel that reporting the truth wasn't enough. He wanted to be part of the change, not just documented from the sidelines. Telling the truth was important, but what if he could do more than write about problems? What if he could help solve them? That's when he began to consider politics. He wanted to be closer to the ground, closer to the people. He believed that real change could only come from within the system. So in 2008 he joined the Democratic Action Party, better known as DAP, part of the opposition coalition. It was during this time that he met Ian Yang Hyan Waa, young first-time candidate with a reputation for integrity and a clear stance on accountability and reform. In March 2008, Malaysia held its 12th general election, and the results shook the country. For more than 5 decades, the ruling coalition Barisan Nasional had held power. It was the only government many Malaysians had ever known. It dominated the political landscape with an overwhelming majority election after election. But this time the ground shifted, fueled by growing public frustration over corruption, inequality, and a widening gap between government promises and people's realities. The opposition alliance, known as the Pakatan Rakyat or People's Alliance, began gaining serious traction. And then the unthinkable happened. The opposition didn't just increase its numbers, they made history. They won control of 5 states, including Sangir, the country's most developed and economically significant state. Barisan Nasional, for the first time since independence, lost its 2/3 parliamentary majority. People flooded the streets in celebration. There was a buzz in the air, a feeling that the country was at the edge of something new. For many Malaysians, especially the younger generation, it felt like the beginning of real change. Tao was one of those people. For him, this wasn't just a political shift, it was a personal affirmation. Everything he believed in, transparency, accountability, and the idea that public office should serve the people, finally seemed possible when Ian Yang Hyan Waa secured his seat in Sangir. Tao joined him as his political aide. He didn't take the job for status or recognition, he took it because he wanted to help build the kind of country he had spent years writing about. Tao Bung Hok wasn't someone who sought attention. He wasn't on stage delivering speeches or making front-page news. Instead, he worked quietly in the background, handling documents, coordinating with local contractors, and making sure development funds were properly managed for community projects. It was honest, meticulous work, and by all accounts he took it very seriously. At the time, under the Sangir state government, each assemblyman was given a fixed yearly allocation of 500,000 ringgit. The purpose was to fund small-scale community initiatives, projects meant to directly benefit the people in their constituencies. That money could go toward resurfacing a village road, repairing a public hall, or sponsoring festive events. Sometimes it was as simple as purchasing flags to decorate a neighborhood during National Day celebrations. It wasn't a massive budget, but it was significant, and because it involved public funds, every ring it had To be accounted for, receipts, invoices, photographs, everything had to be documented properly before a claim could be approved. That's where TAO came in. One of his responsibilities was to ensure that every funding claim came with proper documentation. The goal was simple: to show that public money was being used exactly where it was meant to be. But even with those safeguards in place, the system didn't escape scrutiny. The Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, or MAC, started looking into how state assemblymen were spending their annual allocations. One of the projects that caught Maxi was a claim for 1,500 Malaysian flags supposedly purchased for a National Day event the year before. The cost submitted was 400 ringgit. On the surface it wasn't unusual. These kinds of claims were routine and there was documentation to support them, but soon after, whispers began to circulate that the flags had never actually been delivered. That alone was enough to trigger alarm bells. The MAC suspected the claim had been inflated, or worse, completely fabricated. They believed the money might have been pocketed and the flags used as a cover. This was not a case of millions of dollars that had gone missing, just a few thousand ringgit, but the implication was serious. What made this particular investigation even more sensitive was that it involved members of the opposition who now held real power for the first time, and for many within the old guard that shift was still hard to accept. There were growing concerns that the MAC's investigations were becoming more politically charged, especially when they seemed to target opposition figures more aggressively than those from the ruling coalition. In the case of Ian Yong, MAC officers began building their case quickly. On July 14, 2009, they raided his office at the Sanganger State Secretariat building. Officers seized documents, reviewed files, and questioned staff members, going over claims line by line. TAO was among those they spoke to that day. He had handled the paperwork, his name was on the claim, and that was enough for them to summon him for questioning. The very next day, TAO wasn't under arrest, he wasn't even a suspect, he was just there to help clear up some paperwork. But outside of work he was preparing for something else entirely. For the past 2 years TAO had been in a steady relationship with Socharia, a school teacher. The couple eventually got engaged and had planned to register their marriage on July 17. A wedding photo shoot, honeymoon, and a reception in October were all already in place when TAO walked into the MAC building on July 15. His fiancée So was already 2 months pregnant. This was supposed to be his last day at work before taking some time off to get married, but TAO Bung Hawk never got that chance, and the next time So would see him would be in the mortuary. It's the evening of July 15, 2009. TAO Bung Hawk arrives at the MAC Sanganger office in Shah Alam. He checks in as instructed without hesitation. He's not there to defend himself, he's simply a witness, someone called in to clarify a funding claim. He's compliant, polite, and likely expecting to be out within a few hours, but the atmosphere inside the building is different. By that hour the usual bustle of government offices had faded. It's quiet, dimly lit, with most civil servants gone for the day. TAO is brought into one of the upper floors, the 14th, where the MAC's offices are located. From that point forward he is no longer reachable. His phone and house keys are taken away at the start of the session, and for reasons never clearly explained, those items are never returned to him. There's no legal representation allowed, no lawyer beside him. He is in a government building, questioned for hours alone. The MAC would later claim that the interview lasted about 9 hours, ending sometime around 3:45 in the morning. That's already well outside standard procedure, especially for someone who isn't a suspect. They say TAO is free to leave after that, but that's where the timeline starts to fall apart. There is no official record of his release, no form signed, no timestamp, no formal exit log, and although there is CCTV footage showing him entering the building earlier that evening, there is no footage of him ever leaving. His phone, which should have been returned to him if he had truly been released, is still with The Mac well into the next day when asked why he didn't leave, officers later claimed that Tao had voluntarily chosen to stay the night. They said he asked to rest on a sofa in one of their common areas. According to their version of events, he was last seen alive at around 6 a.m. lying down on a couch inside their office on the 14th floor. That is the final confirmed sighting of Tao Bung Hok just after 1:30 p.m. building staff member discovers a body on the 5th floor balcony of the Mac building. It's a jarring sight, unexpected, silent, and horrifying. The body is lying still, sprawled across the concrete with clear signs of trauma from the fall. Within minutes, word spreads. Police arrive, the area is cordoned off, and then the process of identification begins. The body is confirmed to be Tao Bung Hok. Shortly after, the Mac contacts his family. His sister Tao Leon answers the call. She's told there's been an incident, that Bung Hok has died. For a moment she can't process the words. She assumes it's a mistake. Her brother had only gone in to give a statement. There was no reason for things to go this far. She hangs up, shaken, and calls their parents. When the news reaches his mother and father, they're devastated. What hurts most isn't just that he's gone, it's the confusion around how and why. There's no explanation, no clear answers, only a body, a call, and the overwhelming sense that something has gone terribly wrong. And for his mother, the grief is mixed with something else, guilt. She had warned Tao years earlier when he first told her he wanted to join politics. She told him politics was messy, it was dangerous, it was a game that didn't always reward honesty. But Tao, ever optimistic, had reassured her. He told her he believed in doing the right thing, that he wasn't getting involved for power or influence, that he just wanted to help. But now her son is gone, and no one seems to know how or why Tao Bang Hok had walked into the Mac building as a witness. By the next day he was dead, and the people responsible for his safety have more questions than answers. Was this just an unfortunate accident, or did something happen inside that room, something no one is willing to talk about? In the days that followed Tao's death, his family demanded answers. They wanted to know exactly what happened inside that building, who was with him, and how a man who walked in as a witness ended up dead 9 floors below. But from the very beginning, the response from the authorities was slow and vague. The Mac did eventually make a handful of public statements, all of which denied any wrongdoing and insisted that their officers had followed standard procedure during the interrogation of Tao Bung Hok. They stood by their version of events, saying nothing unlawful had taken place. But aside from that, they didn't offer much else. There were no clear explanations, no breakdown of what exactly happened during those hours. Government officials promised there would be a full investigation, but for the family none of it felt urgent. No one seemed to be taking responsibility, and no one seemed willing to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. In response to the growing pressure for answers, officials doubled down on the claim that Tao had taken his own life, but to his family and to many others, that theory didn't make any sense. He had no history of mental health issues, no financial problems, no known conflicts at work. In fact, he was just days away from getting married. His fiancée was 2 months pregnant. He was excited, hopeful, planning a future. The idea that he would suddenly end his life inside a government office on the eve of his wedding just didn't add up. And the more people looked at the facts, the more it became clear this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mystery, and someone wasn't telling the truth. Then there were the injuries. Forensic experts noted that Tao had a distinct injury on his neck, one that didn't quite line up with the idea of a fall from height. According to Dr. Ponta Brajan, a renowned forensic pathologist from Thailand who was brought in as an independent expert, the location of that injury was in a protected area, one that wouldn't typically be harmed in a fall from that height unless the body had landed in an extremely unusual position. In her view, this pointed to a pre-fall injury possibly caused before Tao had fallen out from the 14th floor window. There was also no suicide note, nothing written, typed, or left behind to suggest he had any intention of ending his life. These details began to shift the conversation from whether this was a tragedy to whether it was something else. Entirely. His fiancée Sol Cherway also brought up something that didn't sit right during the early stages of the investigation. She mentioned a detail that seemed small but unsettling. When Tao's body was found, his shoes were reported to have been scuffed and worn out, but according to Sol that didn't make sense. She told investigators that Tao had put on a brand new pair that very day that he was summoned to the MAC. She said that he was never the type to rotate shoes for no reason. He would only switch to a new pair when the old ones were completely falling apart. So how did a fresh pair of shoes become so battered in just a matter of hours? To her, things were not adding up, and it was one more reason to believe that something was seriously wrong. These major inconsistencies were what led to the first real step forward, a coroner's inquest. This is a legal process used to determine the cause of an unexplained or sudden death, but the goal wasn't to find someone guilty. It was simply to figure out how Tao died and whether there were signs of foul play. However, what was supposed to be a straightforward inquiry quickly turned into a drawn-out process. The inquest dragged on for more than a year, filled with delays, complications, and conflicting accounts. One by one, MAC officers were called to testify, but instead of providing clarity, their stories began to contradict each other. Some officers couldn't remember key details, others gave different versions of the same events. In some cases, their timelines didn't line up at all. The inconsistencies were glaring, and as the hearings went on, it became harder and harder to tell what actually happened and what was being left out. Then came the forensic problems. As the inquest continued, more troubling details started to surface, especially around how the scene was handled. For one, Tao's bag, which was found near his body, had been moved before any proper crime scene photos were taken. That was a severe breach of protocol, but the bag wasn't the only thing that raised red flags. There was also the matter of the window. Investigators believed that Tao had fallen from the 14th floor through a window in one of the MAC offices. That window was thought to be the point of exit, but during the inspection of the scene they noticed something odd. The window handle had been broken and the part that had snapped off was completely missing. No one could explain how or why it had come off. No one could say when it had gone missing, and perhaps most suspicious of all, it was never recovered. Not from the scene, not from evidence storage, not from any part of the building. It had simply disappeared. But the most suspicious and perhaps alarming fact of the inquest was that no luminal tests or blood detection procedures were conducted in the room where Tao was last seen. Those tests could have revealed whether there had been a struggle or if Tao had sustained any injuries inside the building before the fall, but they were not conducted, at least not right away. It was only after external pressure, particularly from independent forensic experts, that those tests were finally carried out, but by that point it may have already been too late. Any crucial evidence could have been lost. The deeper the inquiry went, the more the investigation itself began to look rather compromised. What started out as a search for answers was slowly turning into a story about what had been overlooked or possibly ignored altogether. After more than a year of testimony, hearings, and conflicting accounts, the coroner delivered the final ruling on January 5, 2011. Tao Bang Hawk's death was recorded as an open verdict. That meant the court couldn't conclude whether his death was a suicide or homicide. In other words, they didn't know. Although the open verdict marked the official end of the inquest, Tao's family and much of the country still felt that the real fight for justice had only just begun. In response to growing public pressure and dissatisfaction with the open verdict, the government agreed to take the next step. They formed a Royal Commission of Inquiry, a special panel tasked with investigating not just how Tao died but how the MAC conducted itself throughout the interrogation process. The commission was made up of retired judges, legal experts, and senior government figures. Their job was to take a close look at how the MAC operated to determine whether Tao was treated fairly and whether the agency had followed proper legal procedures over several months. The Commission heard testimonies from witnesses, reviewed forensic reports and revisited the events that took place inside that building on July 15 and 16. Some of the findings were deeply troubling. The Commission concluded that MAC officers had indeed used harsh and aggressive tactics during Tao's interrogation, and while public records don't explicitly state what these tactics were, the Commission described them as relentless, oppressive, and unscrupulous. The pressure placed on Tao, they said, was intense enough to mentally and emotionally break someone down, and based on this the Royal Commission arrived at its final conclusion that Tao Bangkok had indeed taken his own life, but only as a direct result of the methods used against him by the MAC officers. To put it simply, they believed he was driven to suicide. Again, not everyone agreed with that conclusion. The people closest to him said the same thing, that Tao was in a good place. He was steady, relaxed, and looking forward to starting the next chapter of his life. There was no reason for him to throw all of that away, no signs that he would ever take such a drastic step and leave everything he had worked so hard for behind. Just when people thought the case couldn't get any murkier, it did. More than a year after Tao's death, authorities suddenly announced they had found his suicide note, supposedly written by Tao himself. It was discovered tucked inside one of his notebooks, hidden between the pages. But here's what made people suspicious: this note wasn't found during the initial investigations, not by the MAC, not by the police, not even by the forensic team that first went through his belongings. The note only appeared much later, brought forward by the police in the middle of the ongoing inquest. Naturally, this raised alarm bells. How does something as important as a suicide note go unnoticed for an entire year? Why wasn't it logged or documented when his belongings were first taken in, and why did it suddenly appear right around the time forensic experts started casting doubt on the idea that this was even a suicide to begin with? The handwriting was also disputed. Tao's family said it didn't look like he wrote it. Others said the language felt strange, cold, formal, not in line with how someone in distress would typically express themselves. Even the note's placement raised suspicion. If it was meant to be found, why was it hidden in a notebook sandwiched between unrelated pages? Many saw it as a last-ditch effort by the MAC to steer the narrative and attempt to push the suicide theory just as it was starting to fall apart. In the end, the coroner agreed that the note couldn't be taken at face value, its authenticity couldn't be verified, and the timing of his discovery made it impossible to treat as credible evidence. This note was ultimately dismissed from the inquest, but its appearance left a lasting impression, and not a good one. Instead of answering questions, it only added to the growing belief that someone somewhere was trying to cover something up. As the case dragged on, public trust in the MAC and the government itself began to unravel. People weren't just questioning how Tao Bangkok died anymore, they were questioning whether the very institutions tasked with protecting the truth were now working to bury it. 3 MAC officers had been identified as Tao's key interrogators. Their names came up repeatedly throughout the inquest and the Royal Commission, but despite everything, despite the inconsistencies, the conflicting testimonies, and the pressure that was reportedly placed on Tao during the interrogation, not a single one of them was prosecuted. Instead, what began to surface was something even more disturbing. Text messages between MAC officers showed one staff member warning another not to lie during their testimony. Several digital devices, including computers and mobile phones, had been wiped or cleared of data before they were handed over to police. But these were not isolated actions. They seemed like coordinated efforts to control the story before anyone else could get a hold of it. And then in 2014, 5 years after Tao's death, the Court of Appeal finally delivered a landmark ruling. They overturned the open verdict. In their findings, the judges stated that Tao Bangkok's death was the result of unlawful acts committed by persons unknown, including MAC officers who were directly involved in his arrest and interrogation. In plain terms, they concluded that Tao didn't jump out of that window willingly. Something had been done to him and the MAC had failed in its duty to keep him safe while he was in their custody. This was the clearest judicial acknowledgement yet that Tao Bung Hok's death was not a tragic accident but something far more serious. But even after that ruling, still no one was held accountable. Not one officer was charged and not one conviction was made for the Tao family. The years that followed were marked by a painful truth that the system they turned to for justice gave them almost nothing in return. Eventually the government offered the family a compensation payout. They accepted it, but it was never what they were looking for, what they wanted. What they were promised was accountability. Instead they were silenced. Tao's fiancée So Sherway raised their son alone. The life they were supposed to build together never began, and his mother Tungshu__ went years without ever receiving a clear answer to the one question that haunted her most: how could her son walk into a government building as a witness and never walk out? For a while it seemed like that question would go unanswered forever, but then in late 2024, 15 years after Tao's death, the case resurfaced in a powerful move. The High Court ordered the police to finally complete their investigation, and the judge didn't mince his words. He gave the police 6 months to finish what had been delayed for over a decade. This came after Tao's family filed a judicial review arguing that the police had failed to carry out their responsibilities within a reasonable amount of time, and the court agreed. The judge acknowledged just how long the family had been left waiting and made it clear that this case couldn't be left open-ended forever. Tao's parents, he said, had waited long enough. The judge also pointed out just how long the investigation had stalled. Back in 2019, the police had opened a case for wrongful confinement under Section 342 of the Penal Code, but since then the investigation papers had been passed back and forth between the police and the public prosecutor not once but 8 times. Each time new instructions were given and deadlines were pushed back, but even after all that, nothing had been resolved. By the year 2023 the investigation was technically still open, but nothing concrete had come of it. This time the judge made it clear enough was enough. He described the delay as inexcusable and said bluntly, "This isn't rocket science. There was no reason it should have taken this long." Tao's lawyer Ram Capable Singh welcomed the court's decision. He reminded the public that Tao's death happened in 2009, and yet as we approach the middle of 2025, there's still no clear end in sight to him. The delay is unacceptable. The 6-month deadline that was given to the police is final. The judge has made it clear if the police failed to deliver, they could be held in contempt of court. After all these years, the question once again sits heavy in the air: what really happened to Tao Bangkok in the MAC building that led to his death? It's been more than 15 years since Tao Bangkok was found dead, but for his family, time hasn't made it easier. It hasn't brought peace. His younger sister Tao Leland continues to fight. In every interview, every press conference, every court appearance, she's carried her brother's name, refusing to let it disappear from public memory. She once said that her fight is not just for Bangkok but for every ordinary Malaysian who deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter their political affiliation or job title. As for Sokyurai, the wife of the late Tao Bangkok, she gave birth to their son not long after his death. Since then she's raised him quietly away from the spotlight, choosing to shield him from the noise of courtrooms and public debates. She hasn't spoken often, but when she does, her words are steady. All she wants is for her son to grow up knowing the truth, to live in a country where those in power are held accountable and where justice isn't something you have to fight for alone. And while she carries on for the sake of their child, Tao's mother continues to wait. She's never asked for a spotlight. She's never wanted to be the face of any movement. All she's ever wanted was for her son to live a good, honest life, to get married, to have a family, to be happy. Story 3. It was 6 00:00 on the morning of January 6, 1979. The sound of the alarm clock signaled the start of another long day for Tan Kun Chai and his wife Li Maying. After rubbing the sleep from their eyes, they sat up in bed and glanced at the calendar on the wall. Without delay they got dressed, fueled up with a quick breakfast, and headed to the nearby car park where their trusty minibus was parked. The couple were well-known figures in the close-knit community of Block 58 Gailing View, Singapore. For several years they operated a minibus service that transported students to and from school, making them an essential part of the daily routine for many families in the community. Despite having to rise well before dawn each day, the couple took great care in ensuring that their minibus was clean and ready for the day's journey. The couple were not only responsible for safely transporting other children to school, they too also had 4 children of their own to take care of. Their children ranged from 5 to 10 years old. 3 of their boys were enrolled at Bundamatir Road Primary School, while their youngest, a 5-year-old daughter, attended a nearby PAP kindergarten. The 10 children had grown accustomed to their parents' early morning routine and the familiar sound of their minibus starting up downstairs. And because they didn't need to be up at the crack of dawn for school, they often slept in and woke up later than their parents. However, their mother Lying always made it a point to call home at approximately 7:10 a.m. to check in on her children and make sure they were up and ready for their day. It was a routine that the family had established long ago, and it helped to ensure that the children were punctual and prepared for school each day. For Ms. a concerned mother, the routine might have even provided some reassurance that her children were safe. The Tan siblings knew that once the phone rang, it was time to get up and start getting ready for their school day. However, on this particular morning, no one answered. Even after making 3 separate calls, no one picked up the phone. She began to feel worried and uneasy, sensing that something was not right. Desperate to ensure her children were safe, she reached out to one of her neighbors for help. Sensing the urgency in Ms. Tan's voice, the neighbor immediately agreed to help and went to knock on the door of the Tan's flat. However, no one came to the door. Ms. Tan got on the phone once more and urged her neighbor to try again. The neighbor's knocks echoed through the house, loud and persistent, but there was still no answer. Ms. Tan could hear the loud knocking through the phone call. The silence that followed was deafening, and Mrs. Tan began to fear for the worst, but her fears would soon become a reality that would forever change the course of their lives. You're listening to Hans, an Asian true crime podcast produced by One Up Media. This episode contains scenes of graphic imagery and violence. Listener discretion is advised. It was just before 10:00 a.m. on the 6th of January 1979. Mr. and Mrs. Tan had just completed the school drop-off and were now racing back home. Ms. Tan's breathing grew heavier as she spoke to her husband. "I just don't understand. There must be someone at home. I've called so many times. It's just impossible for all 4 of them not to wake up." With his eyes glued to the road, Mr. Tan said they must have woken up early and had already left for school. "Let's not panic. We'll see when we get home." As the minivan pulled into the parking lot, Mrs. Tan could not wait any longer. She hurriedly opened the vehicle's door and dashed towards the stairs, her heart racing with fear and worry. Her husband quickly followed suit, trying to keep up with her, but she was already several steps ahead. The climb up the stairs felt like an eternity. With every step, Ms. Tan's anxiety grew stronger. When they finally reached their door, Ms. Tan's hands were trembling as she fumbled with the keys to unlock the door. As soon as she got it open, she shouted out her children's names, hoping to hear their voices in response, but the house was eerily quiet, nothing except for the sound of her own voice echoing in the empty space. She pushed the bedroom door open with trembling hands, hoping to see her children sleeping safe and sound. However, her heart sank when she found the room empty. As she searched the rest of the house, her panic escalated and she called out her children's names with increasing desperation. Mr. 10 attempted to console her, but he too was growing anxious. Walking towards the kitchen, they noticed something out of the corner of their eyes. A small opening between the bathroom door allowed a faint beam of light to enter, but what they saw next paralyzed the both of them in fear. It was the ominous glow of red, an intense and vivid crimson hue that could only mean one thing: blood. Pushing the bathroom door open, the couple's eyes widened in horror as they took in the scene before them. The lifeless bodies of all four children were piled on top of one another, their bodies mutilated and their skin pale and lifeless. Blood was everywhere, coating the tiles and splattered on the walls. The pathologist's report revealed that each child had a minimum of 20 slash wounds that ran across their head and limbs. Their only daughter, a 5-year-old, was found with multiple slash marks on her face, while the right arm of their eldest child, a 12-year-old boy, was found nearly severed from his body in no time at all. The police arrived at the scene and immediately began to investigate. Before we continue with the details of the investigation, it's important to remember that the events took place in the late 70s. The 1970s were a time of significant advances in forensic science, but the field was still in its early stages of development. The tools and techniques that we rely on today, such as DNA analysis, fingerprinting, and ballistics testing, were not yet made available. Instead, investigators usually relied on more traditional methods such as taking photographs or using chemical tests. However, these methods had their limitations. For example, fingerprinting was a useful tool for identifying suspects, but it was extremely difficult to get a clear print from certain surfaces, and there was always a risk of contamination or smudging. Similarly, blood typing was a valuable method for linking suspects to a crime scene, but it was not foolproof. There was a chance that two people could share the same blood type, which meant that blood typing alone could not rule out a suspect completely. As a result, investigators had to rely on their training, intuition, and experience to solve the crime. News of the horrific murders had sparked a wave of public outrage and condemnation. Despite the persistent calls by the police for witnesses to help with the investigation, no one stepped forward. At the time, it was known that the police would only conduct press conferences at the crime scene for cases deemed to be of utmost seriousness and urgency. This protocol had been established to ensure that the media received accurate and timely information while also conveying the gravity of the situation to the public. This crime was no exception, and at the void deck of Block 58, Gailing View, reporters from all over the city descended upon the scene, each trying to find the best spot to get a clear view of the police as they spoke. However, because the victims were all innocent children that had been brutally murdered, the emotionally charged atmosphere at the press conference was palpable, and some journalists were even moved to tears upon hearing the details of the crime. The investigation into the murders was conducted by the Criminal Investigation Department, although they did not establish a definitive motive behind the killing of the four children. They did acknowledge the possibility of the killings being motivated by revenge. And here's why: the police concluded that the murders were premeditated, which means that the killer or killers had planned this for some time and had taken great care to avoid leaving any incriminating evidence behind. During the search of the crime scene, the police found that the area had been meticulously cleaned. Blood stains were found in the kitchen sink, which suggested that whoever committed the crime had taken the time to clean up after themselves before leaving the flat. Additionally, the two murder weapons, a chopper and a knife believed to have been taken from the kitchen, were missing from the scene. Since the killings were premeditated and a thorough attempt was made to eliminate the evidence, police also could not dismiss the idea of a robbery. During the 1970s, Singapore was plagued by a high number of violent robberies. These crimes were characterized by brutal and senseless acts of violence, often resulting in the loss of life or severe injury to victims. For instance, in 1971, a group of 10 men brutally murdered a 55-year-old businessman and his two employees to steal 120 gold bars worth $500. 000. Similarly, in 1972, on the morning of Singapore's National Day, a 42-year-old wine shop owner was shot and killed by two men who were attempting to rob him. These incidents paint a clear picture of the dangerous and volatile environment that existed during this period. Additionally, these crimes were later proven to be premeditated and well planned. Considering the severity of the crimes and the frequency at which such violent robberies were taking place, it is reasonable for the police to have presumed that the murder of the four children could be a case of robbery. If the motive behind the crime was robbery, it had been executed flawlessly. There was almost no evidence left behind that could be used to identify the culprit. However, as more evidence was uncovered at the scene of the crime, officials began to have reservations about the initial assumption that the motive behind the murders was related to theft or the intention to steal. For example, investigators found no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the killer was either let in by the children or had access to a key to enter the flat. This meant that the killer may have known the family or the children personally, making it easier for them to enter the flat undetected. This indicated that the crime would have been conducted by someone known to the Tan family, such as a relative, family member, or close acquaintance. It seemed highly unlikely that the culprit was a complete stranger. However, as they checked the valuables in the house and consulted with the Tan family, they found no evidence of any missing items or signs of ransacking in the flat. This raised a perplexing question for the investigators. Why would someone walk into the flat, brutally murder four innocent children, and take nothing if robbery was their primary objective? Surely something was missing here. The lack of a clear motive only added to the complexity of the investigation, leaving detectives to consider various possibilities as they searched for answers. This led the police to investigate the personal lives of the victims and their family members in more detail, looking for any potential motives or suspects who may have had a grudge against the family. One of the early theories was that the murders could be related to an illegal taunting scheme. A taunting scheme is a kind of investment plan that was relatively popular back in the 70s. The way it works was that a group of people would each put some money into a pot, and the person who lived the longest would get all the money. In the end, the idea was that the longer you lived, the more money you would get, and if you died early, your money would go to other people in the group. Sometimes people would cheat and try to get rid of other members of the group so they could get more money. In the end, Mrs. Tan's brother even spoke to the media about this idea, suggesting that the family had participated in such a scheme and that it could have led to the murders. The police quickly pursued multiple leads in this direction, talking to people who participated in the scheme and collecting proof related to potential financial disagreements. But despite this, the theory did not lead to any conclusive evidence or any leads. A day after the murders, homicide investigators questioned more than 100 neighbors of the Tan family and made public appeals for witnesses to come forward, but this effort proved to be futile. There were a couple of potential leads in the investigation, however, one of which involved residents claiming to have seen the youngest child, 5-year-old Tanzini, struggling with a man from another block. This lead was the closest the police had to identifying a suspect, but unfortunately the witness could not be located to provide further information. Furthermore, a 68-year-old neighbor of the Tan family stated that she would usually sit outside the common corridor to watch the children playing, which would have given her a clear view of anyone entering or leaving the family flat. But on the morning of the murders, she was occupied with washing her hair and did not witness anyone entering or leaving the flat. To the police, it was extremely suspicious that no one in the vicinity could have seen or heard anything related to the crime. They were now left with only one confirmation that this was no ordinary murder but a meticulously planned act of revenge. Several reports indicated that the perpetrator must have had a close connection to the Tan family as well as possessed detailed knowledge of the Tan's family background and history, particularly Mrs. Tan's medical history. Because whoever did this was apparently aware that Mrs. Tan had undergone sterilization after the birth of her last child, and perhaps they wanted the Tans to have no hope of ever having a family again. This way the Tan household would always be empty and devoid of any happiness. 2 weeks after the horrific murder, a mysterious Chinese New Year greeting card arrived at the family home. The card portrayed cheerful children playing, which only emphasized the heartbreaking reality that the Tans' own children were taken away from them in a brutal manner. However, it was what was written inside that left the couple speechless. The sender of the card had referred to the Tans by their nicknames AAI and wrote this message inside. Not only had the sender of the card addressed the parents by their personal nicknames, it was also signed with the bone-chilling words. This fueled major speculation that the anonymous sender had close ties to or intimate knowledge of the family. It also made the task of solving the case even more challenging. As the murder case investigation unfolded, more intriguing clues emerged. Just 8 days after the gruesome crime, a vigilant taxi driver's call to the police changed everything. According to the records, the taxi driver had reported picking up a man in his 20s near the crime scene at approximately 8:00 am. As the car approached the man, the driver couldn't help but notice that the man's left side was smeared with blood stains. What caught the driver's attention even more was the object that was protruding from the man's waistband, resembling a handle of a knife. Upon reaching his destination, the man exited the taxi, but as he was doing so, the knife had inadvertently struck the door and fallen to the ground, immediately catching the driver's attention. This was the breakthrough the police had been waiting for, the key to solving the case and bringing the perpetrator to justice. All the pieces seemed to fit: blood stains on his clothes, a knife in his possession, his close proximity to the crime scene, and the timing of his departure. It had to be him. With the potential culprit identified through the taxi driver's report, the authorities were determined to track down the mysterious man. According to the taxi driver, when he inquired about the bloodstains, the young man claimed that it was the aftermath of being beaten up by someone. But this raises the question: was it a coincidence that the young man who had bloodstains on his shirt and a knife handle protruding from his pants was found in such close proximity to the crime scene? Well, the short answer is the authorities don't know, but given the circumstances at the time, he became the prime suspect in everyone's minds, and all fingers pointed towards the young man as the possible murderer. Following the taxi driver's report, the police swiftly assembled a team to track down and arrest the mysterious young man. Based on reports, the man was later identified as Uncle, a Malaysian national who happened to be a neighbor of the Tan family. It was revealed that Uncle would frequently visit the Tan family's home to borrow their phone and make calls back to his home country in the 1970s. Owning a telephone was not as common as it is today, and not everyone had easy access to a phone in their homes. This led to a common practice of borrowing phones from neighbors or friends to make calls in many neighborhoods at the time. It was common for residents to share their phones with each other. It helped build a sense of community camaraderie and togetherness. This was particularly helpful for individuals who had limited financial resources or who lived in low-income areas where owning a telephone was a luxury. Moreover, during the 1970s, telephones were typically large and cumbersome wired devices that required connection to a network of telephone lines installed in homes. As a result, in order to borrow a phone from a neighbor, it was necessary to physically enter their house. Given that the young man was a familiar face in the neighborhood, it is likely that the children would have readily agreed to let him in and use their phone. But this sense of community and familiarity that characterized the Galing Baru neighborhood may have made the children unaware of the danger that lurked beneath his seemingly benign appearance. However, 2 weeks after his initial arrest, Uncle was eventually released by the police due to a lack of concrete evidence linking him to the crime. The turn of events left many baffled and frustrated, and understandably so, as Uncle had appeared to be the prime suspect in the case at the time. After his release by the authorities, Uncle and his sister moved out of Block 58, but the reasons why aren't particularly clear now that the investigation into the mysterious young man had hit a dead end. The police turned their focus to the card that had been sent to the Tan family. The card with its chilling signature of the murderer would become a haunting piece of evidence that loomed over the entire investigation. It held the promise of providing crucial clues and insights into the identity of the perpetrator. However, the investigation was impeded by the technological constraints of forensic science during the 1970s. Tracing the sender of the card was nearly impossible. Any potential fingerprints on the card could not be tested or traced due to the lack of advanced forensic technology at the time. Additionally, the fact that it was the Chinese New Year further complicated matters, as sifting through hundreds and thousands of cards to determine where the card was purchased from would be nearly impossible. This unfortunate limitation hindered the investigators' efforts to identify the sender and unravel the mystery behind the killings. As a result, they were back to square one. The card remained a tantalizing piece of evidence that could not be fully utilized in the investigation, which once again left everyone grappling with the question of who could have committed such a horrific act and why. To make matters worse, more and more potential clues began to surface. One neighbor came forward with an account that a suspicious man had mistakenly knocked on her door 5 days before the tragic incident. According to her, the man appeared agitated and in a hurry, but before she could react, he left abruptly without providing any explanation. Despite extensive efforts, the police were unable to identify or locate this mysterious individual, leaving more unanswered questions about his potential connection to the murders and what his intentions might have been. Another neighbor revealed that Lai Meiying, the mother of the 4 children, had lost her keys approximately a month prior to the incident, but to everyone's surprise, the family did not take the precautionary measure of changing their locks despite the potential security risk. This revelation raised serious concerns that the killer may have gained entry into the Tan's family home using the lost keys. If the killer had the keys, it would mean that they had unrestricted access to the residence without ever having to leave any signs of forced entry. But once again, despite the efforts to pursue these leads, police were unable to obtain concrete evidence or make significant progress in uncovering the truth. It's difficult to fathom why someone would go to the extreme of killing 4 innocent children, but perhaps an expert's insights may help to shed some light behind the motive. According to Dr. Majid Khater, the chief psychologist for the Ministry of Home Affairs, there are several possible reasons that may drive individuals to commit such an act. One plausible explanation that he gave is that the children may have witnessed something that the criminal wanted to keep hidden in an effort to silence potential witnesses. Perpetrators may resort to killing children who could have seen something incriminating or could expose any illegal activities. Another possible reason is what is known as mercy killings. Some perpetrators may believe that the world is too harsh or cruel for children to endure, and in a misguided sense of mercy they may take it upon themselves to end the lives of innocent children. This twisted rationale may be driven by a warped sense of compassion or a distorted belief that they are sparing the children from future suffering. A third motivation, as identified by Dr. Khater, is what is commonly referred to as murder by proxy. In this scenario, the criminal is trying to get at someone else and the children become innocent victims in an act of revenge killing. The criminals may intentionally target children as a way to inflict emotional pain or harm on someone else, using the children as pawns in their twisted agenda. Finally, another possible reason for the heinous act of killing children is sexual motivation. In certain cases, criminals with deviant sexual tendencies may specifically target children as victims for their own sexual gratification. The reasons for this could be a perverse drive for dominance and control combined with deviant and abnormal sexual desires towards young children. In the wake of the cold-blooded killings, the four siblings were laid to rest at Chuachicocong Cemetery in a heart-wrenching ceremony. They were dressed in their best clothes, a somber reminder of their young lives cut short. Alongside them, their school bags and cherished toys were placed in their respective burial spots, serving as poignant reminders of the playful innocence that was stolen from them as the burial proceeded. Sources indicate that the grieving mother struggled to come to terms with the reality of burying her beloved children. Overcome with unbearable grief and anguish, she fainted multiple times, unable to bear the weight of the devastating loss she had experienced. Even to this day, the identity of the perpetrator behind the heinous murders remains a mystery for the couple. The lingering questions, the lack of closure, and the injustice of the unresolved case have also exacted a toll on their emotional and mental well-being, leaving them forever haunted by the traumatic events that unfolded in their home. Sources state that the couple abandoned their minibus business and instead sought employment at a plastic manufacturing firm to make ends meet. In December 1983, Lemang underwent a reversal of her sterilization and subsequently gave birth to a baby boy. The birth of their son brought a spark of hope amidst the darkness that had engulfed their lives. But it's undeniable that the memories of the unresolved murders continue to cast a long shadow. With advancements in forensic technology and investigative techniques, the approach to solving crimes today has evolved significantly since the 1970s. If the Galingbu murders were to occur today, the police would have employed sophisticated methods such as DNA analysis, fingerprinting, and enhanced surveillance to gather evidence and track down the culprit. The case would likely be handled with modern investigative tools and resources, but the unresolved questions and lingering mystery would still pose a challenge. In April 2021, CLS or Crime Library Singapore, a charity drive to raise awareness on unresolved cases, conducted a revisit of the Tan family murder case and brought to light new information that had not been previously disclosed. One significant revelation was that the actual scene of the crime was located on level 5 of the building, contrary to the early reports that had indicated it was on level 4. Furthermore, CLS also uncovered that some of the Tan family's neighbors had crucial information that had not been shared with the police during the original investigation. While the exact details of the undisclosed information were not provided, it did add a sense of intrigue to the case, leaving many wondering why these neighbors had not come forward earlier and what other crucial details they may have been withholding. While the newly unearthed information provided by CLS could not be independently verified at the time, it reignited hopes of finally solving the crime that had remained unsolved for over 4 decades. In recent news, a local media outlet was able to locate Ms. Lee, who is now in her 70s and residing with her grandson. Upon being informed that the investigation into the case had resumed, Ms. Lee fell silent for a considerable period of time, her eyes welling up with tears while she appeared reluctant to delve further into the past. She nodded in agreement when asked if she held hope for the case to be solved, and she expressed her willingness to leave the matter in the hands of the police. As for Mr. Tan, well, Ms. Lee reveals that her husband had passed away before the murders could be solved. While the trauma inflicted upon Ms. Lee may remain for the rest of her life, the pursuit of truth and justice for the victims and their loved ones will always be a priority. Story 4. On the 10th of July 2008, Filipino-Canadian film critic and film professor Alexis Teo appeared on ANC's weekly media fest show Media and Focus. With his profound knowledge and eloquence, 28-year-old Teo made a lasting impression on both the audience and the industry. Throughout the interview, Teo showcased his deep understanding and passion for Southeast Asian cinema, particularly in the Filipino film industry. However, just a year later, tragedy struck when Alexis Tesico and his Slovenian girlfriend Nika Bohink fell victim to a heinous act of violence. In the late hours of September 1, 2009, the couple returned to their residence. Nestled in Quezon City, as they arrived at the home they were met with a harrowing scene that unfolded before their eyes. The house had been ransacked and they saw three men recklessly rifling through their personal belongings, but before they could fully comprehend the gravity of the situation, they came face to face with the chilling sight of a gun pointed at them. Then you're listening to Heinous, an Asian True Crime podcast brought to you by One Up Media. This episode contains scenes of graphic imagery and violence. Listener discretion is advised. Alexis Tasico was born in the Philippines but later moved with his family to Canada in 1983. Even while residing abroad, his connection to his Filipino roots remained strong, and he developed a profound fascination with Philippine cinema from a young age. In his early years, he recognized the rich artistic and cultural heritage of his home country and saw the power of film as a medium for storytelling. This passion for Philippine cinema would become a driving force in his life's work. With a history spanning over a century, Philippine cinema has witnessed distinct and notable eras, often referred to as the Golden Ages. These pivotal periods include the 1930s and early 40s. Marked by the establishment of major film studios. During the post-war 40s and 50s, another significant era emerged, characterized by a cinematic revival that originated beyond Manila, particularly in the Visayas, one of the three main island groups of the Philippines. During the 1970s to early 1980s, a significant wave of talented directors emerged and left their mark on the industry. Among these notable filmmakers were Mike De Leon and Ishmael Bernal, who each contributed unique perspectives and styles to the cinematic landscape. Mike De Leon earned a reputation for his meticulous attention to detail and his keen eye for social commentary, while Ishmael Bernal delved into themes of faith, fanaticism, and the intricacies of human nature. Alexis had a deep respect for the cinematic giants who had come before him. Rather than being intimidated, he saw their accomplishments as a foundation upon which he could build his own contributions to Philippine cinema. By his early 20s, he was a strong advocate for the cinematic works of the region and played a pivotal role in propelling the global standing of the Filipino film industry. In 2005, Tio's significant contributions to the field were acknowledged by the Philippine Star, which named him as one of the most important young people in the Philippines today. Driven by his passion for Southeast Asian cinema, Alexis established a website called criticism.com, which became a virtual space dedicated to exploring and analyzing the diverse cinematic works of Southeast Asia. The website served as a hub for film enthusiasts. It provided a wealth of valuable content, including in-depth film reviews, compelling articles that sparked thought and discussion, and comprehensive coverage of film festivals and events throughout Southeast Asia. This platform quickly garnered attention and acclaim. In particular, it had caught the attention of Filmmaker magazine, which hailed it as arguably the most influential intelligent blog of Southeast Asian cinema. Throughout his career, Alexis Chiaco became renowned for his unwavering commitment to exposing foreign audiences to the richness of Philippine independent cinema. However, he often worked long hours as he had to conduct meticulous research and frequently collaborate with various film organizations and festivals. As a result, the path he chose did not come without its challenges and personal sacrifices. Alexis often had to separate himself from loved ones, including his partner Nika Bohink. In 2007, Alexis and N.A. crossed paths for the first time at a film festival in Rotterdam. This particular meeting occurred during a time when both of them were facing personal challenges, and as Alexis himself put it, they were not in the best state of mind at the time. Alexis was dealing with the difficulties of adapting to life in Manila without the presence of his father, who had recently passed away. He also found himself physically separated from his mother and siblings, as they were all back in Canada. Meanwhile, Nika was in the midst of finalizing an issue of a Slovenian film magazine she had been tirelessly editing for over a year. However, the dedication and hard work had taken a toll on her, leaving her physically unwell and emotionally drained. In a piece written by Alexis, he expresses his feelings about Na. He describes how from the very first moment he saw her there was something special about her that immediately caught his attention. It went beyond her physical beauty. What truly struck Alexis was the way she spoke, the eloquence and the way she expressed herself. He writes, "I know sometimes you may think that it was the fact that we both worked in the same field that attracted me to you, but I must tell you that this couldn't be farther from the truth. Why? Because one of the greatest joys I believe one can feel is to share that which they find beautiful with someone who otherwise wouldn't have noticed it, and to see it appreciated." On the 30th of August 2009, Alexis organized a gathering at his house to bid farewell to his girlfriend Na, who was scheduled to return to Slovenia that week. The gathering took place on a tranquil Sunday evening, and it didn't last very long because many guests had to work the following day. Additionally, the air conditioning in the house was either not functioning or inadequately cooling the humid night air, causing everyone to grow even more tired. When Ramelow, one of the people invited to the event, was one of the last few to leave. According to an article he wrote about the event, he had the opportunity to have a private conversation with Alexis. Irwin asked as he noticed Alexis with a look of concern on his face. "Yeah, I'm all right, I'm just worried she's leaving. Ever since she's moved here I've been extremely happy, but I know that she hasn't adjusted well to living in Manila." Irwin assured him that everything would be all right. However, despite his words of encouragement, Alexis remained uncertain. He was still unsure of what to do. 2 days later, on Tuesday, September 1st, 2009, Alexis and Na were out for dinner with some friends. Records state that Alexis was diligent when it came to his household affairs. Alexis had employed 2 domestic helpers to assist with various tasks. Magdalena Pat, one of the helpers, had been diligently serving the household for over 6 years, while 46-year-old Crescella Doc was a recent addition to the household staff. Although Crescella had a clearance permit from the local Quezon City Police Department, she lacked the required clearance from the National Bureau of Investigation. Despite this, Alexis still chose to hire her. Possibly driven by empathy or understanding, Crescella officially began working for the Tasco household on July 1, 2009, but Alexis still had his concerns about the potential risks and, as a result, instructed his other helper Magdalena to test her out and keep a close eye on her over the following months. Nothing went missing and nothing was destroyed. Crescella had proved herself to be a valuable addition to the household. However, on this particular day when the couple was away for dinner, Crescella approached Magdalena with something to say. "Sister, I'm just going out to the convenience store to grab something. I'll be back soon. I need to call my father too." "Okay, I'll be in the room around 7:45 p.m. Magdalena's attention was caught by the sound of Astor, the trusted household dog. Immediately she found this unusual. Astor was typically familiar with her and would happily wag his tail whenever she approached. She also understood that Astor rarely barked, so if he did bark, it must have been because he sensed something out of the ordinary. Curious, she went out to the porch, looking around at the garage, and past Astor she noticed Crescella, who was standing near the dog's enclosure. Crescella appeared to be completely absorbed in her phone, oblivious to the incessant barking of Astor. Magdalena then scanned her surroundings, looking for a sign that might have prompted Astor's barking, but she found nothing. No reason really for Astor to be barking. There were no strangers or intruders. Afterwards, Magdalena returned to the bedroom and Crescella followed suit. They both sat on their beds and watched TV. However, before long, Crescella left the room once again, this time exhibiting signs of restlessness outside the home. Astor barked again. Immediately Magdalena went outside once more, passing by the bench in the garage where Crescella was now Seated, she then walked to the gate and opened it, allowing her to gaze out into the street. Yet as she surveyed her surroundings, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The familiar sight of passing cars and the intensifying noise of crickets were the only sounds echoing through the night. Satisfied that everything seemed normal, Magdalena went back inside the house and used the bathroom. As she exited the bathroom, a man with his face covered swiftly grabbed her from behind, tightly covering her mouth with his hand. In a chilling whisper he warned her, "Don't scream, we will kill you." Another masked man walked in and tightly grasped her arms, preventing her from moving. Meanwhile, a third man, a man in a black suit, the only one whose face she would catch a glimpse of, pulled out a handgun and pointed it in her direction. As she stood there trembling with fear, she could feel the presence of something sharp and cold pressed against her back. Magdalena was forcefully pushed back into a room where the intruders proceeded to tightly bind her arms with rough ropes. To further silence her, they forcefully placed a face towel in her mouth, followed by another towel that covered her entire face. But before her vision was obscured, she gave a desperate look to Griselda. What she saw chilled her to the core. Griselda appeared unnervingly composed, devoid of any visible emotion. She was seated on her own bed, merely observing the scene unfold before her eyes. In the suffocating darkness, she heard the sound of adhesive tape being unspooled, followed by the unsettling sensation of the towel being tightly secured around her head. As she lay there hogtied and bound, Magdalena's ears captured the sound of the television being switched on in the main kitchen, a space where Alexis and Anna typically used their laptops. She recognized the sound of the daily news being aired, but a pungent scent of cigarette smoke permeated the air, which indicated that the intruders were still around. As her mind raced with fear, she realized that the men weren't simply there to ransack the house, they were waiting for something. In the midst of her agony, tears welled up in Magdalena's eyes as she began to whisper prayers to herself, desperately hoping for some kind of divine intervention. 2 hours later, the doorbell rang. Alexis and Anna had returned home. It's now past midnight and Magdalena could hear the sound of police officers entering the room. An officer said as he untied her. Immediately, Magdalena rushes into the kitchen and lets out a deafening scream. The scene that greets her eyes is horrifying. The once pristine floor is now marred by a chilling pool of blood, and crimson red footprints are left all around the house. With tears streaming from her eyes, she races to the garage and discovers the car missing. Magdalena's mind is consumed by one burning question: where the hell is Griselda? In the aftermath of the heinous act that claimed the lives of Alexis and Anna, Magdalena was escorted from the scene. Recognizing the impact of the harrowing event, authorities had her relocated to a secure location. But as she left the home, the scene outside became a flurry of activity, intensified by the arrival of television cameras from news channels such as ABS, CBN and GMA News. In the midst of the growing crowd, a collective of young faces emerged, standing shoulder to shoulder outside the house. These were the filmmakers, writers and college friends whom Alexis had introduced to Magdalena over the years. Their youthful energy mingled with a profound sense of grief, forming a bond that transcended mere friendship. Magdalena's voice, raw with anguish and fueled by a desperate plea for justice, reverberated through the air in a spontaneous outpouring of emotion. She unleashed a heartfelt prayer. God doesn't sleep, he knows exactly what he's doing. God doesn't sleep. A sense of urgency had now gripped the neighborhood as a fleet of police vehicles were parked outside on 39 Time Street. Immediately the police had their suspicions pointing to an inside job that had unraveled within the walls of the couple's abode. Initially one would assume that it had to be Griselda. When we consider the circumstances surrounding the break-in at the house, her behavior before the intrusion was unusual and highly suspicious. First, she would aimlessly wander in and out of the house, her attention constantly fixated on her phone. One could even say that she was communicating with the intruders themselves. However, it was when the intruders invaded the house and started restraining Magdalena that Griselda's reaction truly raised doubts and made us deeply question her involvement instead of showing the expected emotions of shock, fear or panic that anyone would naturally feel in such a terrifying situation. She remained seated next to Magdalena, observing the events unfold with an unsettling calmness. Her composed demeanor in the face of danger should have been a clear indication that she must have had some level of involvement in the crime. However, at the time Griselda was not immediately singled out as the primary suspect in the police's investigation. Instead, they turned their attention to a man named Danilo Hormach. His full name is Danilo D. Hormach Sr., and he grew up as the son of a farmer. As a child, he attended elementary school but never pursued any further education beyond that. In 1989, a new chapter unfolded in his life as he sought a career at Aguila Gas, a notable fuel trucking business under the ownership of a man named Leonardo Tasco, the father of Alexis Teo. Following the unfortunate demise of Leonardo in 2007, the reins of the business were passed on to his son Alexis, who assumed control of the company. The exact nature of the relationship between Danilo and Leonardo remains uncertain, but one would assume they shared a close bond. Records indicate that Danilo had been acquainted with Alexis since he was 15 years old, suggesting a long-standing connection between the two individuals. But on the afternoon of September 5, 2009, at approximately 4:00, Danilo Hormach was arrested for the double murder of Alexis Teo and his girlfriend Na. This might come as a surprise to many. After all, how could the police arrest someone so close to the Tasco family? He mumbles when he speaks. His fingers would often plug at loose threads on his pants, and he always seemed to have a perpetual nervous energy that surrounds him. Given these observations, one might wonder how the police even came to suspect Danilo in the first place. What prompted them to focus their attention on someone so closely connected to the Tasco family? Well, it turns out that Alexis had personally hired Danilo as the family's private chauffeur, and what really added a perplexing twist to the narrative was the peculiar fact that he had abruptly abandoned the car a day before the killings took place. This raised suspicions and led investigators to delve deeper into Danilo's involvement inside the confines of Camp Caringel. The authorities might have probed Danilo furiously. "We know it was you, Danilo, but where are your associates?" Danilo was quiet. "I want you to take a look at the sketch. Tell me if it looks familiar." The officers presented Danilo with a cartographic sketch based on a description provided by a witness. "Tell me, Danilo, does this resemble you?" With a hint of hesitation, Danilo said it did, but only a little. "The cheeks are bigger and the hair is shorter than mine, but other than that it looks like me. You see, I knew it. You even admitted it." The officers exclaimed triumphantly. In their eyes, Danilo's acknowledgement served as a self-incriminating affirmation, reinforcing the connection between him and the depicted figure in the sketch. At first, Danilo vehemently refuted the accusations leveled against him. He says that it was impossible for him to have committed the murders as he was in Metro Manila transporting gas at the time. However, the authorities confronted him with a menacing question. "Danilo, what if we were to find your fingerprints inside the car?" The implications were clear. The mere possibility of his fingerprints being found would be irrefutable evidence against him, and he would have to spend the rest of his life in prison. But it still didn't make any sense. Why would Danilo Hormach kill Alexis? Records clearly state that Alexis was a great boss. He demonstrated kindness and understanding in their interactions. For example, when Danilo requested a loan for his son's college tuition, Alexis declined but instead offered to give him the money as a gift. He also showed concern for Danilo's children and offered to buy one of them a new bike as a reward for his good grades in school. So if Alexis was such a great boss, why would he want to kill him? The case of Danilo Hormach is rife with swirling conspiracy theories. Some say that he may have been nothing more than a convenient scapegoat, and that there are even more influential figures lurking behind the scenes orchestrating the crime. To understand this perspective, it's crucial to delve into the life and work of Alexis Tico, where a prevailing belief exists that there is more to the story than meets the eye. Why did you do this to me? You've got to get a hold of yourself. I don't know, I don't remember. Tio himself was a fervent advocate and pivotal force within the realm of independent Philippine films. At the time of his death, he held the esteemed position of a film professor at the University of Asia and the Pacific. He was a respected contributing writer for numerous publications, both domestically and internationally. Notably, he was on the cusp of launching a regular column in the Philippines Free Press, a highly regarded weekly news magazine. Despite being recognized as one of the leading Filipino film critics of his time, he remained humble and unassuming, brushing off such accolades. However, not everyone in the industry shared the same perspective on his viewpoints. These details fuel speculations among Tasico's acquaintances, who can't help but draw connections between his influential presence in the film industry and the events that transpired. According to Quahineris, a film director and a close friend of Tasco, Alexis possessed a deep passion for delving into the various aspects of cinema and was never afraid to challenge established norms to convey his message. Heiner says he was a very funny guy and always joking around. Although he was young, he had a good working relationship with many directors in the industry, but he also had brashness. He was vocal against the movie studios and complained about how stagnant the Philippine cinema had become. This brashness, as Heiner described it, was exhibited by Alexis in his unwavering commitment to instigate change within the Metro Manila Film Festival. Recognizing the need for reforms, he drafted a comprehensive position paper, fearlessly voicing out his concerns and even proposing ideas to improve the event. However, he never received a reply or saw any changes made by the organizers. While it might be the case that Alexis Tio was merely caught in the unfortunate circumstances of a robbery, an alternative and perhaps more plausible scenario emerges, one in which someone held deep-seated animosity towards him. This animosity could have stemmed from his relentless efforts to disrupt and challenge the established norms of the Philippine cinema industry, thereby unsettling those with vested interests in this scenario. The motive to eliminate him becomes more than a random act of violence. It could be a calculated intent to silence his influential voice and extinguish the fire he had ignited within the industry. In 2010, an important development took place in the case when a resolution was issued and signed by Assistant City Prosecutor Ray Gilbert Espinoza. This resolution cleared Danilo Hammock of all charges, as the city prosecutor's office found insufficient evidence to establish probable cause against him, adding weight to Hammock's defense. Magdalena Pat, the only witness during the crime, provided a sworn affidavit affirming that Danilo was not involved in the robbery and murder of Alexis Tiao and his girlfriend, with Danilo Hammock cleared of charges and declared a free man. The focus of attention now turns to Griselda Diagram, the former housemaid of the Tasco household. They believe that she played a crucial role in the crime, not only opening the gates for the intruders to enter but even orchestrating the entire sequence of events. It was discovered that a few hours following the tragic incident, Griselda had sent a text message to an individual connected to the Tasco family office. The message says, on February 25, 2016, almost 6 years after a warrant was issued for her arrest, the long arm of the law finally caught up with Griselda Diagram. She was taken into custody by the authorities in Angelay City, a town nestled in the province of Papana. Coincidentally, this location was in close proximity to the cemetery where Alexis Tasico was laid to rest on May 4. Griselda was finally brought before the Quezon City Regional Trial Court. The court, after carefully reviewing the evidence presented, reached a verdict of guilty beyond reasonable doubt for the crime of robbery with homicide in his ruling, the judge says, and a victim of the assailants, as she claimed to be without her active involvement from the very moment that she opened the door of the house and let the assailants in up to the second that she helped in the escape of the assailants and to the time that she went with the assailants voluntarily, the crime would not have been committed and consummated. Griselda Diagram was sentenced to 40 years in prison and ordered to pay 350,000 Philippine pesos to each of the heirs of Alexis Tasico and Nika Bohink. That's equivalent to approximately 6,728. By 2018 it became evident that the gears of justice were primarily in motion for Griselda Diagonal. As for the three mysterious men that had entered the house, two of them continued to elude capture and only one among them had been definitively identified. Erwin Ramlue, cherished confidant of Alexis, poured his emotions into a heart-wrenching essay dedicated to the memory of his dear friend. He expressed the pain he felt following the loss of his close friend, as well as the anger and frustration that he experienced during the arduous pursuit for justice. In the closing passages he writes, "The last thing I wanted to do when I was asked to write this was to remember their deaths, but if anything I felt that it had to be remembered." This episode was researched, produced and written by Yo Guang Jin with audio engineering by Ethan Sam. Story 5: The Sumar family case. Buried alive. The worst betrayal is the betrayal of a loved one who enjoyed boundless love and trust. However, despite all the pain, bitterness, resentment and disappointment, many still cope with it and go on with their lives. But what if the betrayal is learned on the deathbed? And the realization of this becomes the last thing that a person experiences in his life. That's what the horrifying story of the Sumar family is about. This case struck to the heart and brought to tears even experienced criminalists with a huge experience, which in their practice have seen everything except that the subhumans who committed this heinous crime, despite the initial death sentence passed on them, are still alive and are actively trying to appeal the court's decision. But let's look at this story from the beginning and try to understand how it came to be that a young girl whom the spouses Sumner loved and cared for as their own daughter decided to deal with them in the most brutal way. High school sweetheart James, or simply Reggie Sumner, and Carol Alfred were born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. They were the same age, knew each other since childhood, went to the same school and were in the same grade. Over time their friendship and childhood affection grew into sympathy. School children themselves did not notice how they began to get closer. In 1959, when the teenagers were 15 years old, a romantic relationship between them and they began dating. Friends noted how beautiful and harmonious it was, a couple, and in the home archives of James and Carol later in life kept their joint photos where they are young, happy and ahead, as it seemed to them at the time. They are waiting for a long and happy life for both of them. It was the first time in their lives that their feelings were strong and mutual. The young people were practically inseparable both in and out of school and seriously considered getting married as soon as they turned 18. Their parents approved of their children's choice and were not against their marriage, but life had a very different outcome. A long separation. In 1962 the lovers graduated from high school, but they did not have time to get married because a few months later James was called up for military service in the Army. He and Carol decided to postpone the celebration until his return home and also agreed to write each other regular letters. Time passed, the separation dragged on, and in the mid-60s the young man was sent to a hot spot in Vietnam, after which contact with him was cut off. Carol didn't even know if her lover was alive because he stopped writing to her. Carol decided to continue her studies at the same time getting a job at the Charleston Air Force Base. A few years later she married, but the first marriage soon broke up and the spouses did not have common children. In 1975 the young woman married a second time to a certain Richard Alfred, from whom in 1977 gave birth to their only child, a daughter, Rhonda. However, the second marriage was also unsuccessful because the spouse abused hot drinks and regularly raised his hand on his wife. Toward the middle of the 80s, Carol could not stand the constant abuse from her husband, took her daughter and filed for divorce, but Richard did not leave his ex-wife alone and literally pursued her, trying to spoil her life, and in 1987 he succeeded. He bought a handgun with ammunition and after another reception of a large portion of alcohol went to the ex-spouse to deal with her. Alfred rang the doorbell and Carol, unsuspecting, opened it for him. Behind her in the room was 10-year-old Rhonda, but the presence of his daughter did nothing to deter the drunken father, who pulled out a gun and shot Carol several times right in front of the child. He then got into his car, drove to a deserted area, pulled out his gun and fired the remaining bullet into his temple, dying on the spot. Carol was lucky to survive because the sound of gunshots and the desperate cries of the child were heard by neighbors, who promptly called an ambulance and the police. The young woman was on the verge of death. She lost a lot of blood and for several days her condition was assessed as critical. She underwent a number of complex operations, blood transfusions, and gradually recovered, except Carol became completely blind in her right eye and was left disabled for life. Toward the end of the 90s her health again seriously deteriorated. She did not feel well, noticeably lost weight, suffered from severe pain and weakness. Having undergone a full examination in the hospital, she heard a disappointing diagnosis: liver cancer. As it turned out, then in 1987, when doctors were fighting for her life, her body was accidentally carried the hepatitis C virus, which Carol did not suspect and did not treat the disease. As a result, the virus that affected her liver destroyed it for years, leading to cancer. However, thanks to treatment and properly selected supportive therapy, Carol's condition was stabilized. She had to take her prescribed medications daily for the rest of her life, as well as undergo regular medical checkups to make timely adjustments to her treatment. Carol lost her job at the Air Force Base after suffering severe gunshot wounds. Now that cancer was added to her disappointing diagnosis, she was unable to work physically or be on her feet for long periods of time, so Carol took a job as a call center operator for a cable TV company in her hometown of Charleston. As for James, once in Vietnam, he didn't have a chance to report for a long time. The war dragged on. The man was severely wounded, nearly losing his leg, and spent an extended period of time in the hospital. His name was mistakenly included in the lists of the dead, so even his relatives thought that he was no longer alive. Sumner was lucky enough to survive and return home years later. By that time the connection with Carol was long lost. She had changed her place of residence, married, and also believed that her first lover had died in a hot spot. Soon James married, but because of the injuries he received in the war, developed diabetes and a number of other chronic diseases, he was never able to become a father. A few years later the marriage broke up and he has lived alone ever since. James took a job as a simple laborer on the local railroad and no longer expected from life pleasant surprises. The voice sounds painfully familiar. In the fall of 2000, Carol was having a normal workday, answering phones and giving advice to customers, when the young woman answered another such call. She heard a familiar voice that sent shivers down her spine. She immediately recognized her first high school love, but she was afraid to make a mistake because she thought James was dead. Carol answered all the customers' questions and then suddenly turned to him, saying his full name. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then the man timidly asked how she knew his name. Carol burst into tears in response and replied that she was the girl he had dated in high school, that he had once wanted to marry. For the next few minutes they both just cried into the tube, unable to utter a word. Then they found out that they still lived in their hometown and agreed to meet the next evening. The meeting 38 years later. According to Rhonda's recollection, her mother came home from work that day excited, looking like a lovesick schoolgirl and talking non-stop about James. The next day Carol prepared for the date, trying on dresses, doing her hair and makeup. Carol realized that she was no longer the young beauty James Sumar remembered her to be, but she Wanted to look good and win back the heart of the man she had once been in love with. It was an exciting meeting for both of them, for the couple had not seen each other for 38 years. They talked about everything in the world and could not talk enough, told each other about the joys and sorrows of their lives, about failed marriages, about work, about health problems, and remembered how happy they were once together. Their old feelings flared up again. James and Carol were eager to make up for the lost years. They began to see each other every day, and after just a couple of weeks they decided to move in together and start living together. 5 months later the couple married and Carol moved into her husband's home in the Riverland Terrace neighborhood. Family life and troublesome neighbors. The couple first resided in their native Charleston, South Carolina. They were in love, happy, engaged in the arrangement of everyday life, and reverently cared for each other because both were not old and had health problems. Next to the couple lived the Cole family, with whom James had been acquainted for many years. The head of their family, named Stephen, had also once fought in Vietnam, was severely wounded, and remained confined to a wheelchair. His wife Natalie disappeared at work and afterwards did not hurry home at all, preferring to spend time in the company of friends somewhere in the bar. Their daughter Tiffany was left to her own devices from a young age, often hanging around on the street with nothing to do and no money for even small pocket money. When James and Carol first started living together, Tiffany was still in high school, and good-natured Carol immediately sympathized with the neighbor girl. She genuinely felt sorry for the schoolgirl who was actually unwanted by her own mother. Carol, for 5 years, in every possible way patronized Tiffany, invited her to her family lunches and dinners where delicious food, periodically bought the girl clothes, and even gave money for small expenses. Carol treated her like her own daughter, surrounded her with care and attention. When in 2004 the Summoners decided to sell their car, brand Chevrolet aluminum minivan, Tiffany asked if she could buy it from them in installments, since the girl had no money and she needed the car like air. The couple decided to give her the vehicle for next to nothing. The agreed amount was ridiculous, which was divided into a dozen payments and stretched them over a whole year. A forced move and a mysterious disappearance. In early 2005 the Summoners decided to move to the sunny state of Florida. It was a forced measure because the health of both spouses deteriorated markedly, and doctors recommended that they move south and closer to the ocean. By that time they were both retired, so they decided to make a drastic change in their lives. Carol and James sold their spacious home in Charleston and acquired real estate in Jacksonville, the largest and most populous city in Florida. They also purchased a new Lincoln Town car. The couple were extremely happy and settled in a new place, making plans for their future life together. Every day Carol called her adult daughter Rhonda, to whom she told her about everything that was going on in her life, shared her thoughts and plans. Therefore the girl was very surprised and excited when one day in June 2005 her mother did not call her and did not answer her call. At first Rhonda chased the bad thoughts away from her and hoped that everything was all right with her mom and her husband and that they would call her back soon. But the next day the situation was no different. Rhonda called her mother and James' cell phones every half hour, but the phones were now unavailable and the answering machine on her home phone went off, but all messages went unanswered. On the third day Rhonda decided to drive herself to another state to see if her mother and stepfather were okay. She left early in the morning and was on the road for about 5 hours before she reached the Summoners' home. The first thing Rhonda noticed was the absence of a car, but that was only the first oddity. When the girl went to the front door she found that the door was ajar. The house was quiet and there was a light on in one of the rooms, even though the sun was shining brightly outside. Rhonda called loudly for her mother and James, but there was no answer. Then she went into the kitchen where she saw a table set for two with food that looked like it had been there for at least 3 days. It looked as if the owners had gathered for dinner but had suddenly abandoned the meal and gone somewhere else. In addition, the house itself was a mess with things strewn about and some doors and cupboards left open. It seemed as if something had been searched for, but what was it and who was it? In the couple's bedroom on the bedside table there were some medications that were vital to them. There were their mother's cancer pills which she took 3 times a day and a bottle of insulin which James took by the hour. In addition, the couple's cell phones were completely dead. Rhonda realized that without their medications and cell phones her mother and stepfather could not leave the house, let alone leave their home for a long time. So she immediately contacted the police to report the incident. Strange imposters. The couple and their car were promptly put on the wanted list, and all bank cards belonging to Carol and James were blocked the same day. The first few days of the search yielded no results, and it was not possible to find the summoners themselves or any witnesses hot on the trail. However, on June 12 several events occurred at once which allowed the police to get on the trail of the criminals. First, a man called one of the banks who introduced himself as Mr. James Sumner and complained that his card was blocked and he could not withdraw cash. Upon checking the card information, the bank employee immediately suspected something wrong. He offered Mr. Sumar to contact personally the nearest bank branch to settle the problem, but the man simply hung up at the same time. Almost a few minutes later, from the same number but already in another bank, a woman called from the same bank who introduced herself as Mrs. Carol Sumner and reported a similar problem with the blocking of the card. When offered to come to the bank in person, she categorically refused, saying that she could not do so for health reasons but was in dire need of money right now, and asked to return access to her savings, which of course was refused. The information about the calls as well as the recordings of the phone calls themselves were immediately handed over to the police. On the same day at the station they were played to Rhonda, who stated with certainty that the voices did not belong to her mother and stepfather. This was obvious from the beginning because both spouses were in their 60s and the voices sounded too young. The police immediately assumed that the imposters are directly related to the disappearance of the summoners, and they either kidnapped the couple and hold them somewhere forcibly or killed them, having previously extorted information about bank accounts and cards. The search. A few days later, the missing couple's car was found abandoned on a deserted road in a wooded area. No traces of blood and struggle were found in the cabin, but in the trunk experts found hair and sweat marks which, as it turned out, belonged to both spouses. It became clear that the owners had been taken away in the trunk of their own car, and there was little chance of finding them alive. When the police checked the couple's bank transactions, it turned out that money had been withdrawn from their cards several times after the summoners had stopped contacting their daughter. After reviewing the ATM surveillance footage, it was discovered that the money had been withdrawn by a young man who could not be immediately identified. In addition, a request was made to trace all calls from the number from which the imposters called the bank. The SIM card itself, as it turned out, was bought without a contract with prepaid time. Shortly before the disappearance of the spouses, it was not possible to establish the name of the buyer in this case, but it was learned that on June 6 the call was made from this number to a car rental company. As it turned out, a guest of one of the hotels rented a car brand Mazda RX-8 in the name of Tiffany Cole, and it was on this car later an unknown young man drove to ATMs where he withdrew money from cards belonging to the summoners. He withdrew $1,000 from the woman's card and almost $3,000 from her husband's card. Thanks to beacons built into all rental cars to track their location, investigators were able to find out that the already mentioned Mazda RX-8 parked at a hotel in Charleston. There was promptly dispatched a capture team which literally broke into the room where the attackers were resting, celebrating their impunity. Young thugs. The room was literally littered with packages and receipts from various stores, and among the purchases were clothes, gadgets, video games, cosmetics, perfumes, and a lot of expensive alcohol. Inside was a girl and 2 guys who were clearly not expecting visitors from the police. They were 23-year-old Tiffany Cole, her 24-year-old boyfriend named Michael J. Jackson, and 19-year-old Alan Lindell Wade. The young men looked surprised, confused, and even scared as handcuffs were snapped on their wrists. All three were taken to the police station and placed in different rooms for questioning, but at first they pretended not to understand what they were accused of or simply remained silent. A search of the room also turned up the summoner's bank cards, a laptop belonging to the couple, some of Carol's jewelry, James' expensive coin collection, the keys to their Lincoln Town car, and pawn shop receipts in the name of Tiffany Cole. As it turned out, part of the stolen jewelry Mrs. Sumner Tiffany managed to pawn, and the money spent with friends. After several hours of interrogation, when the irrefutable evidence found in the hotel room was presented, Tiffany was the first to speak. The girl sobbed and claimed that she and her friends had robbed the elderly couple but did nothing else to them, and then went on the run and started spending other people's money. She also admitted that there was another guy with them, 19-year-old Bruce Kent Nixon, to whom they paid $300 for help and never saw him again. As it turned out, Bruce really agreed to go to the crime, for they promised him a fixed amount, and after that he spent all the money on illegal substances. Finding the guy was not difficult, because he lived in the same Charleston and did not even think about running or hiding. He was arrested right at his parents' house, a careless phrase and a devious plan. Bruce once realized how the committed crime could turn out for him, and therefore agreed to cooperate with the police to avoid the death penalty. What the young criminal told caused horror and frost on the skin. It all began in May 2005 when Tiffany went to the Summoners to give them the next payment for the car bought 6 months ago. The girl always went to them personally because hospitable Carolyn James invited her to stay for a night or a few days, fed her delicious food, and even spoiled her with gifts if she came with friends. There was always room for them in the house and at the table. This time Tiffany arrived with her new boyfriend, and both of them were kindly invited to dinner, and since the time was late, the couple stayed overnight at the Summoner's house. During the meal, the Summoners talked about how they settled in the new place, and Carol inadvertently mentioned that they had almost $100,000 left after the sale of the house in Charleston, so they could live for themselves in their old age, not deny themselves anything and not worry about anything. With that phrase, Carol effectively sentenced herself and her husband to death. Tiffany and Michael looked at each other, and during the night while at the couple's house, they began to make plans on how they could get their hands on this impressive sum of money. In the morning they said goodbye and returned to South Carolina, where in a couple of weeks they found accomplices, distributed the roles and responsibilities of each, and began to realize the plan. The heinous confessions of criminals. On June 6, Tiffany rented an inconspicuous car, and Bruce and Alan stole 4 shovels from somewhere. Together they drove to the suburbs of Jacksonville, where they chose a deserted spot in the woods and began digging a deep hole that would become the grave of the Sumar couple. On the morning of July 8, Tiffany bought rope and duct tape at a hardware store, which she gave to her accomplices that evening. Bruce and Alan knocked on the door of the prospective victim's home, pretended to need help, and asked to be allowed to make one call from their home phone. Carol thought these young men were strange, but she let them in nonetheless. Figuring they really needed help, once inside they immediately attacked the defenseless woman and her husband, who came running to her screams, threatening them with a toy gun. The couple's hands and feet were tightly bound with duct tape, blindfolded, and questioned about money and valuables in the house. Under torture and death threats, the couple gave the intruders all the details of their bank accounts and the PIN codes of their cards, hoping that their lives would be spared. But as soon as the bandits received the necessary information, 2 more people entered the house. They helped drag the couple into the backyard of the house and stuffed them into the trunk of their family car, driving the Lincoln, and in the front seat were Alan and Bruce, and behind them in a rented Mazda RX-8 were Tiffany and Michael in case they encountered a police patrol on the way who would have intended to stop the car with the couple. In the trunk, the second car should have diverted their attention to themselves by accelerating sharply or flagrantly. Breaking the rules, however, there was no one in their path and both cars made it to the scene unharmed. In the trunk, James managed to free his arm and remove the bandage and duct tape from his face and also from his wife's face so she wouldn't suffocate, but there was nothing else. They had time to do. What was their surprise, bewilderment and shock when the trunk lid opened and the couple saw among their captors Tiffany and her boyfriend who had recently visited them. The summoners were led several dozen meters through the woods to a grave prepared for them, after which they simply pushed them there. The couple desperately pleaded for their lives, but the young criminals decided otherwise, killing the couple in the most brutal way imaginable, burying them alive. According to Bruce, they covered them with earth for about an hour, and the whole time the bound elderly people cried, confessed their love to each other, and said goodbye. As the examination later showed, the spouses died of suffocation, and in their mouths, respiratory tracts and even stomach were found pieces of soil in which they were buried. Having finished their gruesome work, the outlaws abandoned the Lincoln in the woods and returned to town in a rented car. They went to the Sumar house, where they took all the valuable things they could find, and then returned to South Carolina and began to spend the loot. However, after 2 days the stolen cards were blocked, and after another 4, all participants in the crime were taken into custody, trial and conviction. The only one who from the beginning fully admitted his guilt and agreed to cooperate with the investigation, hoping for leniency, was Bruce Nixon. It was he who showed the burial place of the spouses and told in detail about everything that happened on that terrible night. Tiffany claimed that the initiator of the crime was her boyfriend Michael, who had lost his mind when he heard about the fabulous amount of money that remained with the summoners after the sale of the house. Her lawyer insisted that the girl was a wingman and was not directly involved in the murder herself. Jackson and Lindell preferred to remain silent, but the collected evidence spoke eloquently for them. The jury did not believe in the innocence of Tiffany Cole because she took part in the development of the criminal plan, rented a car and came up with a diversionary maneuver. If they suddenly chased by the police, helped dig a grave for the spouses, and after renting stolen items in the pawn shop and happy to spend the money. This was evidenced by a lot of photos taken by her in the purchased clothes and in a limousine which the criminals rented to celebrate their success. As a result, Bruce Nixon was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to ever be released, and Jackson, Tiffany and Lindell were given the death penalty. The criminals filed multiple appeals and grievances, but they were all denied, and the sentence remained unchanged, except that in 2023, 18 years after their atrocious crime, that very same death sentence was never carried out. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at MR Night Cared True Crime Stories. Remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.